Hello, everyone. Today, the motion that we're discussing is this House believes that states in the developing world should financially incentivize urban to rural migration. So, what I'm going to do is talk first about just the general context of the debate, then talk about the affirmative case, and then lastly, talk about the negative case and do a bit of a wrap up on like what sort of perspectives maybe could be added within the debate, in addition to the stuff that I talked about. So, firstly, with regards to like what the context of the debate is, I think the biggest context of the debate is the fact that in the developing world, there has been mega cities that have come into existence in an unsustainable manner. So if you look at a lot of mega cities in the developing world, so you can talk about Mumbai, Delhi, Dhaka, even KL, and so on and so forth, have very, very high populations. And in certain cases, the population even goes across like not just 10 million, 20 million, sometimes like very close to 30 million as well, and not in a very big space. We say that this urbanization did not happen in a planned manner. So what happened is then within like very small, densely populated cities, there have been like people living together, and that has like caused a lot of problems within these urban centers. But on the flip side, a lot of the economic development that has happened in developing countries have happened within these urban centers. We just say that the bedrock of the economy was these places, even though they were densely populated to an unsustainable extent. Um, the economic benefits of urbanization still accrued, and these economies still grew. So, for example, if you look at the Bangladeshi economy, barring the last year, obviously because of the pandemic, but before that, had been growing upwards of 6% every year for the last about 8, 9 years, which is pretty good. If you look at the Indian economy, again, barring the last year, you'll see that it has been growing for a long time due to the sort of our benefits accruing from urbanization. So that is like the basic context of the debate, in the sense that yes, there has been unsustainable urbanization, but there were economic benefits that accrued from it. Then the question is, A, should it not have happened to begin with? But B, is it now time to maybe roll back a lot of the unsustainable urbanization that has happened? And maybe that will not cause economic harms, but rather create better living standards for people in general. And also, just generally speaking, in a lot of cases, yes, wealth or economic benefits can be the metric of the debate. But I think just general living standards can also be a metric of the debate. To say that maybe one side has like less wealth or less economic benefits, but that side is able to prove more sustainable living, better living generally, and better, like generally better life for people without mishap, and so on and so forth, and a lot of the other stuff that are problematic with unsustainable urbanization. So yeah, that's probably like where the comparative is going to lie. That's how the debate is going to turn out. Now moving on to the affirmative side of the debate. What is the affirmative side going to do? So first, as I said, the biggest problem here is unsustainable urbanization. But then what does unsustainable urbanization look like? What are the problems with unsustainable urbanization? So you look at slum areas that have developed within these places where people live in not greatly built houses in very packed areas where you have issues with sanitation, with hygiene. In a lot of cases, you have issues with availability of food and so on and so forth. So they're not the most economically prosperous places. And the fact that they live in such an unhygienic, in a densely populated area, creates a sort of cesspool of diseases, creates a sort of cesspool of, in a lot of cases, urban places where there's a lot of infestation of crime and so on and so forth. So living conditions aren't really great. There could be diseases. They don't have access to proper social welfare and so on and so forth because of the dense population that exists in a lot of cases. They don't have access to like proper sanitation, hygiene, and so on and so forth. In a lot of cases, again, these areas turn out to have higher crime rates than usual, or higher crime rates than the rest of the city. And that is also bad for children growing up. That is bad for general people living there, obviously. And oftentimes, even we've seen other disasters like a fire spread. So, for example, if there is a fire in even like a tiny fire at the corner of a house, it spreads so fast across places. So the incidents like this have happened all the time in places like Dhaka, Mumbai, Delhi, where there would be a fire and it would just spread across the slum in minutes because there is not enough spacing between the houses. and it's such a densely populated area and so on and so forth. So the living conditions of these people who migrate from rural to urban areas because of economic benefits. So because there aren't enough job opportunities in rural areas, because they want a better life than they have in rural areas, because the agricultural income that they get in the rural areas is just not enough for them, they end up moving to urban areas. And when they end up moving to urban areas, because urban areas are not planned to be able to handle that level of rural urban migration, this in a lot of cases, those systems just collapse on their own, because of the simple reason that they were just not expecting that many people to migrate because of economic opportunities and so on and so forth. But also, I think obviously there is a rational side to this decision-making calculus. There's also the irrational side of this decision-making calculus, where an urban life is more glorified. They think everything's there in urban life. Urban life has the most opportunities and so on and so forth. Where it's somewhat empirically true, it's also not fully true to the extent to which that the urban areas are the only places with opportunities within these places. There's obviously economic potential even in the rural areas. However, I guess there's some concession to make in the fact that urban areas do have on net more economic opportunities. But then the question is, even if there are economic opportunities, would you still have that at the expense of the living conditions and standards of people? Now, the motion is about incentivizing financially to these people. Obviously, you can't force people out, because obviously you generally don't want to defend a side of the motion where you have to force people out and take away their freedom of movement. But obviously, financial incentives are fine, in the sense that financial incentives are just giving them an incentive to go back to their rural areas, or just generally make sure that rural areas also have potential economically, because these urban areas are just too densely populated. Also, I think there is a clever strategic way to handle this, in the sense that because of a lot of crisis, because of COVID-19, because of the lockdowns that have happened within these places, a lot of the urban to rural migration has already happened, in the sense that people have realized that a lot of um, opportunities that were supposed to be within the urban areas with regards to the service industry, the entertainment industry, the tourism industry, got shut down because of the lockdowns, and they had to move back to the rural areas. So if there were any time to sort of enact this policy properly, it would probably be now, because it would be easier to just convince them to stay back in rural areas, or people who return to just send them back, because they have at least gotten somewhat used to living in rural areas after having lived in urban areas for a long, long time. And just say that financial incentives obviously are likely to be somewhat significant, in the sense that obviously you don't need to mention the amount in the model, but just say that it's significant enough to be able to have some influence on their decision-making calculus between moving to an urban area for economic benefits versus the amount of economic benefits. Sorry, the moving to a rural area and getting the financial incentive from the government versus the economic benefits they can get by staying within the urban area. So hope that obviously the amount has to be set to that extent, whether it be a one-time lump sum payment, or whether it be like a recurring payment that people keep getting the longer they are in the rural areas. I think a recurring payment model is better. I suppose they probably wouldn't have that big of an impact within the debate, but I would generally prefer a recurring payment, because like you want them to like stay back in rural areas. So the longer they stay, the more installments that they keep getting. So I think the recurring every month payment is probably like a good idea in this particular instance. So in terms of incentivizing, obviously make the argument that it is going to be possible that people are going to move back to rural areas. And then what is going to happen? So a few things that is going to happen in those cases. So a lot of the investment and a lot of the economic opportunities that happen in the urban areas happen because of the fact that it's so densely populated. And if you want to open up a shop, a business, or if you're like selling products like Unilever, Unilever is a company that sells like a lot of products, soaps, shampoos, and so on and so forth. If you're a company like that, you just want your distribution centers to be in urban areas. It's just easier to do business, right? More people are there in a smaller area, less costs, so you can just maximize your sales, minimize your costs, and make the most profit. But the moment there is an active form of urban to rural migration happening, and like rural centers are also filling up with people to a certain extent, I think this gives businesses a huge incentive to just invest within these places, create jobs, in search of like, market expansion and so on and so forth. So firstly, just in terms of analyzing the fact that, rural areas can have opportunities if this policy passes and if you incentivize them. But secondly, as I said, I think the biggest impact here is to the fact that, they probably won't have like a substantially better house within rural areas. However, rural areas are much more spaced out and have generally better living conditions than slums in urban areas because they are not jam-packed within very small spaces and the inherent problems that accrue with jam-packed small spaces. So for example, if you have a fire in a rural area, it's likely not to spread that far. If you have diseases in rural areas, it's possible that you don't come in contact with your neighbors all the time because you live somewhat spaced away, and it probably won't, like if it's a contagious disease, then it probably won't spread. By the way, the reason I keep mentioning contagious diseases and stuff within developing world context is because it's still so very relevant, but obviously more relevant now with regards to COVID-19, but it's very relevant across these places with regards to so many diseases that are like contagious and come every now and then within these places. Like even if you look at like places in Bangladesh, even in countries like Africa, malaria is still a thing. There's so many diseases that are like an issue. So the problem, all of the problems that I mentioned will in a comparative get better if people start moving to rural areas just because of management of space. And that is like the main sort of analysis or argument for affirmative here. Like if you can get if you can explain the management of space better, then you can explain a lot of the arguments better. So you can talk about like improvement in hygiene. You can talk about improvement in hygiene. You can talk about like less chances of diseases spreading. You can talk about management of disaster situations like fires, and even other natural disasters and so on and so forth. So all of this again accrues to that analysis of management of space, and that management of space is much better within rural contexts than it is within urban contexts. And then you do the comparative of under our world, we can have economic benefits because in rural areas that we give an incentive for companies to invest more, because now it's not always continual rural to urban migration where rural populations are dwindling and like generally decreasing. It's also in the reverse. It also happens in the reverse way as well. So companies have an incentive to invest in rural areas if they did not already. But I think also you can explain and somewhat that if people start moving from urban areas to rural areas, like companies will also have the incentive to set up factories and so on and so forth. Given that a lot of economic growth within these places come from industrialization and like setting up factories of like either cloth factories, shoe factories, and so on and so forth. If a lot of the workers move in rural areas, then there is an incentive to set up factories in different parts of the country and generally make use of the cheap labor that exists within developing countries in general, whether it be domestic industries or foreign direct investment and so on and so forth. So I think there are economic angles in which you can play it out. Obviously, it's not as efficient or as great for companies as urban centers, because in urban centers, you get like one factory, you get so many people who are able to work in that factory. But it's still something that is worth looking into. It's still something that is still possible. And urbanization isn't the only way of development. Development can be decentralized in general. Urbanization being the only way of development is not something that has like that is absolutely set in stone, so as to speak. So I think you can analyze the economic aspect in a lot of ways, but the management of space part is absolutely something affirmative can win. And if in comparative they can prove that even if there is some economic problems associated with this policy, the management of space thing gives us so many impacts that that is beneficial. So that's pretty much the affirmative case from my head. The negative case for me is obviously like there are very strong arguments coming in from the affirmative with regards to management of space. I think the negative generally needs to be able to mitigate to a large extent. What do I mean by this? Just talk about incentives that the government has generally in making urban spaces more livable, which is to say that urban spaces need to be made like if you have slums and so on and so forth, you need to manage these spaces, make sure that you expand the city. So for example, the area of Dhaka city increasing, the area of Delhi increasing, the area of Mumbai increasing, the area of Addis Ababa increasing. So many cities within the developing world need to just expand, and be better planned and so on and so forth. Obviously, it's difficult. However, given that affirmative has the fiat to pay so many people to incentivize them to go for urban rural migration, I'm pretty sure negative has enough money to be able to have better planners, generally invest in things like housing for poor people, subsidized housing, and so on and so forth. So the money that would have given them to go towards rural areas, you put money in urban planning, you put money in subsidized housing, and so on and so forth, to solve some of the issues that are coming in for affirmative. And then I think you push a higher burden on the affirmative, but the affirmative can't just get away with characterizing the status quo. They need to prove structurally why this is something that is inherent to urbanization and it cannot be controlled. Obviously, I think that can be done in the sense that the urban to rural migration is, rural to urban migration is just so hard to manage that it can be proven to be structural. But at least, first of all, that mitigates a lot of their harms. But secondly, it puts a far higher burden on them in improving the management of space argument than generally then generally that is there, which is to say that if you don't do these crucial pieces of mitigation and framing, then it's just easier for affirmative to just take away the debate. So I think negative needs to do that first and foremost. Secondly, as I was alluding to it like throughout so far, the biggest argument coming in from the negative will probably be the economic benefits, because the economic benefits of urbanization are vast, in the sense that you have so many people within such small tight spaces that investment is so much better. In general, people are more interested in investing in your country, setting up factories, cheap labor access that you get from urban areas and stuff like that. Generally, you get higher returns on infrastructural investment. So for example, you can build bridges and roads within urban areas, and that's it, versus having to build bridges and roads across the entire country, because of the fact that there is an infrastructural issue with all developing countries. All developing countries don't have superior infrastructure, means that it's easier for them to build infrastructure in certain pockets of their country, and those pockets are basically urban spaces or urban areas or cities, so as to speak. In those places, it's easier to build infrastructure and get economic benefits out of that infrastructure. And for that, you need to have rural urban migration, or at least hold on to the urban population that you have to maximize economic returns out of these populations. So for example, get that benefit of setting up maybe like a service, like many service businesses like restaurants, hotels, and other investments that go with the industrialization that is also subsequently happening at the same time. So people keep demanding these services, and your economy keeps growing, and so on and so forth. So I think there's a very strong economic point to suggest that you don't want massive amounts of urban to rural migration, because that will just destroy the whole idea of like concentrating people into an area and trying to get economic growth out of that concentration, because that concentration is very crucial for economic growth in general. So I think that would be an argument that is important. And then say that because developing countries lack social security nets and still have issues with regards to poverty, it's probably more important that these people have some opportunity at bringing their family out of the cycle of poverty, and maybe be able to send this child to school and break out of that cycle of poverty, and maybe finally within 1 or 2 generations give their the next generation or the one after that a good life to live, in exchange of coming to an urban area and having like a steady flow of income and more predictable economic benefits out of it. Also, I think secondly, it's important to just point out the fact that rural economies are really based on agrarian economic exchanges, which is to say that it's mostly agriculture. The problem with your economy depending on agriculture is income inelastic. What do I mean by this? In agriculture, say you produce food mainly and crops, right? If your income keeps increasing, you don't demand more and more and more food as your income keeps increasing. To a certain extent, yes, as initially your income will increase and you'll demand more food. But after a certain point, you'll be like, I don't need food anymore. I'll demand other things. I'll probably want a car. I'll probably want to buy a house, and so on and so forth. I'll probably want to go to a better vacation, go to a better restaurant, and so on and so forth. So agriculture is income inelastic, because agricultural demand does not proportionately keep up with the increase of income. However, industrial goods or even service goods, so as to speak, are income elastic. Would you say that the more your income is, the more industrial goods you demand, the more service that you demand, and so on and so forth? And industrial goods and services are concentrated and better served within urban areas, so as to speak. We just say that the difference between economic development that happens within rural areas and urban areas is massive. And in this case, it's very crucial to understand that to have the sort of maximal economic growth, you want urban areas to have that population flow, to have that concentration of people within these places. So even if there is some bad space management in certain cases, it's still worth it because of the massive economic benefits that accrues due to people staying in urban areas and sort of making it a great place economically to have economic growth for people and generally have economic opportunities for people. So that then ends up being the comparative overall. So as you can see, I think at the end, what it boils down to is affirmative is going to talk about management of space and a lot of other issues. They have to mitigate the economics argument coming in from negative. Negative has to talk about the economic argument. They have to mitigate the management of space stuff coming in from the affirmative side. And I think generally speaking, even within these two broad clashes, there are so many arguments to make about like how economic growth can be obtained on either side, how you can manage space better on either side, how generally speaking, like your side can handle issues such as, you know, disasters, diseases, hygiene, and so on and so forth, which is obviously connected to the management of space, but also can be somewhat different as well. So on both sides, you can make these arguments and you can think about it more. I suppose generally you can research about this more if you just, you know, go onto the internet and look at issues that people face, especially people who are living under the poverty line within these countries, in like mega cities and stuff like that, and whether or not mega cities are good for economic development. Like just if you type if are mega cities good for economic development, you can see like lots of articles, lots and lots of articles within these places and so on and so forth. So I think these things are worth looking into. But that was basically the main trade-off within the debate, the main arguments that you can run, and the sort of ideas that you can run, and the context of the debate overall. Hopefully that was helpful. And yeah, best of luck for the next debates. Hope round 2 went well, and next rounds will go well for you guys. Best of luck.